And now, News 4 at 5:30.
And topping the news at 5:30, Saturday marked 30 years since the Oklahoma City bombing. At about 9 in the morning, a bomb exploded at the Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people, including 19 children.
It is the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. And our local tie to that tragic day, the bomber, Timothy McVeigh, was from Western New York. He grew up in Pendleton.
The quicker we can make all the different recoveries, the more at ease we can put the family members. That's our goal.
Hometown people, and I feel for it anywhere, but when it's in your own front yard, it's a different story.
Everyone actually on our team has never seen anything like this. We work inside and outside trying to go through the debris and find what we can find.
Timothy McVeigh was an ex-Army soldier and security guard. In the years following the attack, he would tell two Buffalo News reporters his story. We have them here now.
Dan Herbeck and Lou Michel met with McVeigh in person on death row and then witnessed his execution. Lou and Dan, thank you so much for being here. This is an important moment, I think, in history, marking 30 years since one of the deadliest days in American history. Let's talk about where you all reflected on that day, 30 years ago on Saturday. What was going through your mind as an author of one of the books on this case?
Just the horror of it. I know the people down in Oklahoma City live it on a daily basis. It's sort of the forgotten terrorist attack. 9/11 overshadowed it, but we have to remember that this is the worst act of domestic terrorism. By virtue of the fact an American, Timothy McVeigh from Pendleton, New York, Star Point School District, committed that act.
You both met with him in prison, and you recorded his voice. You wrote this book. He wanted to tell his story, right? What was that story? What made him do this in his own words?
McVeigh, the biggest issue in his life that drove him to this crime was gun rights. He was convinced, first of all, he loved guns. He loved shooting guns. He had been taught about guns by his beloved grandfather in Pendleton. He was convinced that the U.S. government was going to send soldiers to every home in America and take people's guns away. Now, like many of the conspiracy theories that people follow today, that was completely ridiculous. There was no foundation of truth in it. He really believed it. And this act against the U.S. government, with 168 innocent people killed, was his strike against the government, hoping to prevent that from happening.
Can you guys talk to us a little bit about your process, how this played out, and what it has led to not only writing this book, but then we'll talk a little bit about the Netflix documentary that was just released. So what was your process? How did you make that connection?
Well, I live in Niagara County, and I was just starting out at the Buffalo News then, and I would pass his father's house every day. I'd been sent out to Michigan, where his co-conspirator Terry Nichols lived. And when I came back 4 or 5 days later, I started passing Bill's house, and all of the national media gradually left. They had the satellite vans. And one day there was nobody there. I just parked at the end of the driveway, walked up the driveway. I can still hear the crunching of the gravel going up, kind of nervous. Knocked on the door. Bill came out. He's a tall man, Bill McVeigh, Tim's father, who I consider something of a victim himself. Because he did not go along with Tim's views. He came out and he started looking over my head, like, get off my property. And then this elderly woman came up and said, Bill, you don't remember me. She parked in the driveway. Winifred was her name. And she said, but where are your neighbors, Bill? And he says, I remember you, Winnie. And we used to count money at the bingo hall. Wow. And she just said, Bill, we're your neighbors and we're here for you. And she left just as quickly. And I said, well, how do you feel about that, Bill? And he said, and she kept saying, you have no control over your grown children. And then she left. And I said, Bill, how do you feel about that? And he said, he just put his big ham-like hand to to his chest and he said, even though they're your grown children, you still love them. And he talked a little more, and then I got some questions in. I left. I called my friend Dan Herbeck, who was at federal court. I said, I got this interview, Dan. And Dan said in federal court, in his little bureau, that, Lou, I've just been thinking about that. What if somebody in my family had done that?
Sure.
And he said, I would still love them. And Dan wrote the lead to that story. Even though millions of Americans may hate Timothy McVeigh, his father still loves him.
Wow.
It's great, Dan.
Yes. And you guys then got to know him because of this connection. Timothy had reached out to his father and said, you know, I'd like to tell my story. When were you first allowed in to meet with him and start, you know, communicating there?
Well, Lou had been, this was a long, painstaking project. Lou had spent years writing letters to Tim McVeigh in prison. And little by little, Lou was able to draw him out. And finally, he agreed to meet with Lou in the prison. And at first, it was just, there was no talk of a book immediately. Little by little, he decided he wants to tell his whole life story, and I'm going to tell it to you, Lou. And then Lou brought me in to work with him. And it literally took years before the first interview. Then we both went out there on different occasions. We interviewed him a total of 70 plus hours, which I don't think the prison system allows that anymore, but it was a unique experience.
You guys may have been presented with this over the course. Of course, we're journalists, and in our line of work, we often get questioned about why we choose to do certain stories. I imagine there have been people at somewhere in this world at some point since you've written that book that say, how dare you give that man glory or give him any more attention than he deserves, right? He's evil and he should just be forgotten about. Yeah. To that, you say what?
We say that this was a part of our history. This book has been widely read by law enforcement, psychologists. The book's over 25 years old, 27 years old. It is still selling today. American Terrorist, Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombing. And we knew that we were doing a public service. People did call us, you say that soapbox, people called us accomplices to murder.
Wow.
And that was very hard to take. But fortunately, everybody from the New York Times to the Washington Post to Newsday to LA Times said, no, these two journalists from Buffalo were doing the public a service.
Wow.
Agreed.
Let's listen in now on the documentary trailer. This just came out 30 years later. Netflix put this together, and you, Lou, are highly involved in this documentary. Let's look at the trailer really quick.
April 19th was a special day.
We were having breakfast, and then there was this explosion that rocked us out of our table.
The whole front of the federal building is gone, all floors to the roof.
We need all fire ambulances in here.
You probably heard it and felt it, an explosion of some kind downtown.
We've never had a bomb like this in the United States.
I started screaming. People were walking like zombies.
I thought maybe I was dead, but I was buried alive.
I got up and I walked to the door. It was like snowing paper.
The men just started saying, there's another bomb, there's another bomb.
This is going to be the largest investigation in the history of the FBI.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's about half of the trailer that we just watched there. Lou, when were you contacted by Netflix, and how are you involved in this documentary?
It was a 2-year process, and Dan and I licensed our audio from the interviews. We kept them because we knew that that would be an important part of history. They're down at St. Bonaventure University for scholarly research. But just to let you know, when the second day during the 4-day interview out in Florence, Colorado, he admitted that he did the bombing. He wasn't going to do it the first day, and then he said, no, I'm going to tell you, it's on you. If you tell anybody before the book comes out, you scooped yourself.
Every year on the anniversary of the bombing, I don't know if Lou feels the same way, but I always think about the victims, the people that were in that building. What a horrible way that would be to die, to have a gigantic 7-story building collapsed on top of you. Some of those people were suffering for hours and maybe even days before they died. And Lou and I both went out to Oklahoma City on multiple occasions. We interviewed people who were in the building, and the scary, chilling stories that they told are what stick with me.
Yeah.
Wow.
And you'll see some of those people interviewed in that documentary. One of them is really special.
One of them is Renee Moore. She lost her, I believe, her 6-month-old son, and she worked downtown in another federal building, and she went running over. And the thing, you know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, one of the harshest things McVeigh said to us during the interviews was that the people of Oklahoma City need to get over it. You're nothing special.
Wow.
And he used profanities with that. And so McVeigh's voice is there, and Renee Moore is just sitting. I believe she heard that remark. Maybe she didn't, but she's just sitting there silently for about 10 or 20 seconds, but it's like an eternity. And you wonder what the victims think when they hear something so darn evil.
Yeah.
Were there other instances like that where it was strikingly evil? Obviously, this is an evil act that killed 168 people, but within those moments, those meetings with you guys, were there other periods of evilness that took you aback?
Well, I'll tell you, we're portraying an evil act here, but if any of us in this room met Timothy McVeigh, you'd be amazed at what a likable presence he was.
Interesting.
Until he started talking about the bombing, his hatred for the government, his very, very cold-hearted, unfeeling attitude toward the people that were killed. We were really taken aback by some of the cruel things he said. In fact, we didn't use all of them in the book because they were so hurtful, even making jokes about the victims. It's tough.
Yeah, Dan Herbeck, Lou Michel, thank you both so much for coming in.
Thank you, guys.
Authors of this book. You can still buy the book. Give us the title again.
American Terrorist Timothy McVeigh and the Tragedy at Oklahoma City.
And you'll see their audios in that new Netflix documentary. You'll see Lou as well in that interviewed.